Hello, my name is Bob Mann, and I'd like to take a few minutes and talk to you about Quebec in Canada. A little bit about their food and their culture. Quebec is native to Algonquin, Iroquoian, and Inuit groups that were originally there before the French first started colonizing it. Back in 1534, Jacques Cartier claimed it for France. They kept it until about 1763 when issues with Britain caused them to relinquish it and gave it to Britain. In 1783, there were large numbers of New Englanders, which were British and some French, that fled from the United States after Britain lost the war and the United States became the United States. So they fled the 13 colonies and headed up into Quebec. There were well over 50,000 British citizens and also a large number of French. After that point, there were waves of immigrants between then and the middle to late 1800s that came from Ireland and Scotland, which also affected their culture. Quebec has had a tumultuous history with Canada itself because it's constantly trying to separate itself because they believe they are their own culture and own entity. Um, they've tried to separate numerous times, and the last time was in 1995, which went to vote but failed by less than 1%. Quebec's population is a little over 8 million as of 2012. Their capital city is Quebec City with a population of about 715,000. Their largest city is Montreal. When people were asked to self-identify, 58% of them said they were English and French Canadian, while 31% said they were French. Irish was about 5.8%, and Italians were about 4.1%. French is the official language of Quebec, but English is spoken quite a bit. 84% are Catholic, and about 5% are Protestant when it comes to their most dominant religions. Their geography is mostly plains and plateaus covered with evergreen forests. Um, they have well over 10,000 rivers and 1 million lakes, even though most of the lakes may be smaller. They border the Atlantic Ocean, and they have 4 mountain ranges in Quebec itself. The Appalachians, which come up through the U.S. and into Quebec. They've got the Chic-Choc, the Torngat, and the Laurentian, which follows the St. Lawrence Seaway in through between both the United States and Quebec. When you talk about the financials in Quebec, all of these will be in U.S. dollars. Their average household after-tax income is about $46,500. Home price about $200,000. A dozen eggs can be purchased for $2.44. A pound of tomatoes $1.93. 1 pound of apples will get you for $1.50, and 1 pound of potatoes around 65 cents. When you start talking meats, a pound of boneless chicken breasts will be $5.71. When you talk about their health care, their basic health care is free for everyone. But when it comes to like eye care and dental, it's not covered. You have to pay for that. But it is covered for their children and anyone over the age of 64. When they're prescribed drugs or they have to purchase drugs, there's a deductible they have to meet at first. And then there's a copay amount for that point forward, up into a maximum per month. And then everything is covered. They have some of the same issues that the rest of the Western world does. As they get more modern, their lifestyle is becoming more sedentary, and people are making poorer food choices. A lot more fast food, canned foods, boxed foods, stuff like that. Which, of course, increases their obesity, their type 2 diabetes, hypertension has gone quite a bit higher, and they're having cancer issues. They're doing the same thing that most people are doing. They're coming up with health programs to push exercise and having people try to make healthier food choices, such as not saying yes to the supersizing at fast food restaurants. When you talk about their foods, they originally, when they first came over from France, were eating a lot of the Aboriginal foods. Potatoes, beans, corn, squash, wild game, birds, and fish. The Aboriginals were teaching them how to catch and prepare the wild game and how to use the fish and the birds. Some of their traditional dinners that we'll talk about in a few minutes were made with birds back then, where now they're made with beef and pork. Shortly after they were here, they were missing the foods that they were common in France. So they started cultivating vegetables and cereal grains. They missed their bread and their pasta. So as more and more ships were brought over and they were starting to trade, they were getting livestock like beef and pork and chicken and cultivating more of the vegetables that they were used to. They tried to remain true to the French tradition, but as the British invasion came through, as Irish immigrants came in, and even the U.S. influences when the war ended with the Revolutionary War, that added a lot more depth to their culture and brought other cultures in and mixed with theirs. The spices, they had their common spices, which I listed here, like the cinnamon and the cloves and the fennel and the oregano, but they were so used to all the spices that were used in France that every time the boats came over, they brought all the spices that they were accustomed to. So they had every spice that you could imagine that they would want to use very shortly after colonizing the seaboard, because the ships were constantly coming over to trade. The staples back then, and basically still today, are wheat for their pasta and breads, dairy, which became a big staple after the New Englanders fled the Revolutionary War and brought the dairy processes up with them. Quebec became a dairy powerhouse with the milk and the cheese and the butter, especially cheddar cheese. Potatoes, it's kind of dwindling a little bit now in Quebec, but for the most part it's still a staple. It's in a large number of their traditional dishes. Beef is their largest agricultural product. Eggs, they export eggs throughout Canada, so Quebec is still huge on eggs, and it is a big staple in egg products. When we talk about their culture and the fact that there's been like a culture fusion with some of the dishes that they have, poutine is a very famous dish in Quebec. Matter of fact, my family just had it last night in a restaurant here in northern Wisconsin. But it's French fries and a beef type gravy and cheese curds all mixed together. I mean, just doused with gravy. It's a very heavy, thick, calorie laden dish. Same thing with the next dish down, which is basically baked beans. Those were brought up from New England. In Canada, it's filled with maple syrup. It's very sugary, very sweet. It's a breakfast dish quite often, and another very calorie-laden, heavy dish. And it's because the temperature in Canada is usually cooler or cold, and they need more calories to keep themselves warm and for activities outside, which is also backfiring a little bit with their health, considering their lifestyle is turning more into a Western lifestyle where it's getting more sedentary. The last one on here is what they call a Quebec breakfast. We would call it a brunch. It would have anything from baked beans and pork chops and ham to vegetables and fruit and you name it. Crouton is another thing. It's a pork. Well, we'll talk about that here next. Croutons is a ground salted pork with cinnamon. It's got savory and some cloves in it, sometimes onion, sometimes garlic, but it's a cold, pasty, like condiment that you would put on toast, and it's a huge breakfast item. Now, it's got a big French influence, but what takes it away from the French equivalent is the ground salted pork, which when they first colonized the area, they had to use a lot of salted meats. So you'll notice some of their dishes now have salted pork in it because of that. Like the pea soup. That's dried yellow peas. It's got cubes of salted pork and carrots in it. It's a big, heavy, thick, stew-like soup, and it's great on a cold morning or a cold afternoon to have that before you go out The fur traders probably would have had it quite often before they went out into the snow and cold to go find their furs. Their dessert, because the French influence, is the sugar pie, they call it. It's made with cream, eggs, flour, some brown sugar. A lot of times it's made just with maple syrup instead of brown sugar, because maple syrup is a huge food item in Quebec. Some of the British influence, their meat pie. It's spiced ground beef, kind of just stuck into a pie crust and baked. That was one of the ones that was made with like pigeons and birds when they first came to Quebec, because it was easier to find the birds and to still make the meat pie that they were used to. The other one was Chinese pie. That was made with ground beef, potatoes, corn, but it could be made with any type of a small game or birds. The reason it has the name Chinese pie is thousands of immigrants came over from China and they were building the railways. It was really easy to make this shepherd's pie or Chinese pie and serve it to the Chinese or anyone else working on the railroad for quick meals, heavy, laden with calories, for working out in the cold and the snow and the hard, laborious work. Cheddar cheese, which was basically brought up from the New England area of the colonies. The British settlers brought it up, but now it is a huge item that they sell throughout Canada and around the world. They're very finicky about their cheeses, and they're very proud of their cheddar cheeses. The Sugar Shacks, maple syrup is extremely important. It's a huge deal up there. Like in northern Wisconsin, we have our deer hunt, which is extremely huge. All the families get together. You have the huge feast with Thanksgiving in the middle of it. Well, the Sugar Shacks are similar to this. As they're bringing the maple syrup in, or they're bringing in the sap and they're turning it into maple syrup, they have huge family celebrations and feasts. Maple syrup is used in a huge number of recipes. You'll see in the bottom picture there in the corner where everyone's sitting there eating, all that food there will be smothered in maple syrup as they eat it. On the bottom left, you see what they're making is maple taffy. They take the maple syrup when it's really nice and hot, they pour it into snow and ice. It cools pretty fast and makes it nice and sticky. They use a spoon or a stick and twirl it up so everyone can have a nice, sweet, sucker-like dessert. It's a taffy that they eat right before they go out and get in the horse-drawn carriages and have a great time enjoying the snow as well as feasting with the family. Some of the finishing points. Quebec is still a melting pot. There's thousands of newcomers showing up all the time, some from French-speaking countries like France and Belgium and Algeria, but there's thousands of them showing up from Switzerland, Indochina, Morocco, Tunisia, Poland, China itself, Argentina. They're accepting basically anyone from anywhere and trying to sell their country as a great place to move to. Their food has always been influenced by immigration and war. They have the same health issues as most of the Western cultures. And like I said previously, the climate is a major influence on all of their foods. That's my presentation. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.